Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. My name is Sheila Rabin and I am the ORCID US Community Specialist at Lyrasis. So I provide dedicated technical and community support for institutional members of the ORCID US Community, which is a consortium for ORCID membership in the United States. And this session, ORCID API Basics and Benefits, is designed for anyone really who is interested in learning about the ORCID API, but specifically for those at ORCID member institutions or those who are interested in working with the ORCID member API. And so that is the focus of our webinar today. Okay, there we go. So just to give you an overview of what we're going to cover, first I will talk about what is the ORCID API. I'll talk briefly about the public API and how that is different from the member API. I will talk about the benefits of the member API for research institutions, universities specifically. I'll cover the basics of how the ORCID member API works. We'll cover some advice on planning for your own technical API integrations. And then I'll wrap up with talking about the ORCID US community, the services we provide, and what we can do for you. So if you have any questions as we go along, please just type those into the chat, and I will have time for questions at the end of the session. So with no further ado, what is the ORCID API? So I'm going to do just a quick little recap just to make sure we're all on the same page. ORCID stands for Open Contributor and Researcher Identifier. And the basis of ORCID is the ORCID ID, which you're seeing here on the screen. It's a free, unique, persistent identifier for individuals that looks something like this. And an ORCID ID is also a URI that links to the corresponding ORCID record, which looks a little bit something like this. So some of the common data that can be found in an ORCID record includes things like employment and education information, works. There are lots of other types of data I'll cover in just a minute, but that's the basics. You know, things like publications and presentations, similar to what you would find on a CV or a resume. And in fact, you can think of ORCID as kind of a new replacement for a static Word doc CV. So ORCID provides an interoperable, universal kind of CV system with the goal of making a researcher's life as easy as possible. So rather than having to update a Word document resume every time they do something, researchers can use their ORCID record as a persistent, reliable way to keep track of their achievements, their contributions, and affiliations throughout their career, despite any changes in name or institutional affiliation, area of study, or location. So as an individual, I have full control over my ORCID record and the visibility of the data within my ORCID record. So each different data point in ORCID has visibility settings that I can adjust. And those range from public visibility, where anyone can see that data on the web. There's private visibility, so that no one can see the data but me. And finally, there's trusted parties only, where only individuals and organizations that I designate as trusted parties can see that data. So when individuals interact with their ORCID record, they log in at orcid.org. But organizations can also interact with individuals' ORCID records as trusted parties using the ORCID API, which stands for Application Programming Interface. And so participating organizations like publishers, funders, and research institutions can use the ORCID API to interact with their affiliated researchers' ORCID records in a few different ways, and we'll explore those in a minute. The graphic that you're seeing here depicts a researcher in the center with their ORCID ID and their ORCID record, and then the different organizations that that researcher is affiliated with. So in this example, you're seeing a publisher, an employer, and a funder, all of which are connecting directly to the researcher's ORCID record using the ORCID API. And through that, they're able to also connect with each other. So there's an element of data flow between stakeholders and between systems. So you can think of ORCID as kind of a central hub of connectivity and sharing researcher and research information. So in some cases, the organization may be reading data from the researcher's ORCID record rather than having researchers, say, fill out forms to collect data and report their activities. In other cases, the organization may be actually writing data to the researcher's ORCID record to make a clear assertion about the relationship between the researcher and the organization. And so the ORCID API makes this possible. So what exactly is the ORCID API? So as I mentioned earlier, API stands for Application Programming Interface. And many online platforms like Twitter and DPLA have an API, which essentially just describes the rules that need to be followed in order to interact with that platform on the back end. So APIs in general allow different software systems to communicate with each other machine to machine so that data can be transferred between two completely separate systems that would otherwise be siloed. Hence this silo graphic that you're seeing on the slide. We're seeing a row of silos here, which can be compared to different systems that you might be using at a research institution. So for example, you might have an institutional repository and maybe a publishing system that are likely administered by the library. And then in other parts of campus, you may have a research reporting system or a grants management system. So all different kinds of separate systems that can be thought of like silos, where the data within each system is only accessible from within that system. Okay, so the crosswalk going over the top of all of these silos can be thought of like an API to allow a degree of interoperability between the data contained in each individual system. So this is just kind of one metaphor to help you think about the functionality of an API and what that allows. So basically, the ORCID API provides instructions for how a system needs to be configured in order to interact with your researcher's ORCID records. You can think of the ORCID API also like a puzzle piece that connects different organizational systems with ORCID. And once these systems are configured according to the ORCID API instructions, they can communicate with ORCID records and thus with each other. And this is not limited to systems just at your institution. Any system can be configured to work with the ORCID API, therefore enabling interoperability of data across the wider research and scholarly communication ecosystem, as we saw in this graphic. So at a research institution, the most common types of systems for ORCID API integration are what you see on this list: central identity management systems, HR systems, research reporting and profiling systems, grant management, publishing, repositories. I've got a link down at the bottom there to a list of some of the common systems in the US, and also ORCID workflows for various types of systems. Don't worry too much about trying to write these links down. I will be sending out the slides, so you'll have access to these links after the presentation. Uh-oh, what's happening? I'm not sure what's going on with that sound. Let me check my connection. Stand by. Can everybody hear me now? Is that a bit better? I apologize for the sound weirdness. Hopefully that will not be reflected in the recording. And as I just mentioned, I will be sending out a link to the recording as well as these slides after the session. So you will have access to that, and you'll have access to all of the links that I've included in these slides too. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Now let's continue on. Let's see, where was I? Okay, so again, these are the types of systems that are typical for ORCID integration. And as I mentioned, any system can be configured to integrate with the ORCID API. Although if you're using vendor systems, that will require the vendor to configure the ORCID API integration. Whereas if you're using like an open source or a home-built custom system, then you would need a developer to configure and work on that integration. Okay, so the specific functionality that can be achieved in systems that are integrated with the ORCID API varies depending on which ORCID API is used. ORCID provides both a public and a member API, so we're going to cover those details next. So the ORCID Public API is free for anyone to use, and the member API can be used by ORCID member institutions that pay a fee to support that member API functionality. So the public API allows for collecting authenticated ORCID ID numbers, searching for public data in ORCID, and also reading any public data from ORCID records. And there are two types of member API. There's basic and premium. Premium has all of the same functionality as basic, it just offers an additional aspect of functionality. So both basic and premium allow for the same as the public API, collecting those authenticated ORCID ID numbers, reading public data, but also reading any data that's set to trusted parties only, so that limited access data, and writing to ORCID records, which the public API does not allow for. And the premium member API, which is what ORCID US Community member institutions have access to, also allows for enabling auto updates, so that once your researchers have connected their ORCID ID with your integration, anytime a change is made to those individuals' ORCID records, your institutional system can automatically get notified and be updated accordingly. So that is kind of an overview of the two types of APIs that ORCID provides. And you can see how you'll get more functionality from the member API as opposed to the public API. So if you're interested in using either of these options, you will need to get API credentials. That means a client ID and a client secret that would be given to you by ORCID. The client ID is a little piece of information that would be used within your system integration, while the client secret is just for internal purposes and should be kept secret for security reasons and not shared publicly with anyone. So on the screen here, what you're seeing is an example of what a client ID looks like and what a client secret might look like. And combined, those are often referred to as your API credentials. To get access to public API credentials, that happens through your individual ORCID record. So you would need to be logged into ORCID, and you would need to go to the developer tools tab drop down of the ORCID record as you're seeing here. So it's important to note that the public API credentials are granted to an individual through their ORCID ID and cannot be transferred from one individual to another, whereas member API credentials are granted to the member institution. So for institutional systems, the member API is recommended because it's more sustainable and you won't have to worry about the individual who registered for the credentials leaving the institution. Okay, I see that there's still a little bit of sound issue happening, and I'm very sorry about that. I'm not sure what's going on. If everybody can just bear with me. Okay. Now, For the member API credentials, your organization must first be an ORCID member. So what you're seeing here is a screenshot of our ORCID US Community website. And the ORCID US Community provides premium ORCID membership for nonprofit institutions in the US. It's an ORCID consortium administered by Lyrasis. I see a question in the chat that I'll go ahead and cover, which is, if you are a premium member through the ORCID US Community, your institution has access to 5 API credentials or API keys so that you can use those in different systems at your institution as needed. So when you are ready to start working on an API system integration, there are basically forms online that you would use to request your API credentials from ORCID, depending on the type of integration that you're pursuing. So for example, if you're working with open source systems like Vivo or OJS, or if you have your own custom homegrown systems, you will first need to fill out ORCID's form for Sandbox credentials, which you're seeing here on the screen, so that you can work in a development environment first, test everything before it goes live. So basically, ORCID provides a sandbox development environment that replicates the production environment. So you can test your integration before working with any real data. And you can create as many fake ORCID IDs as you need for testing purposes at sandbox.orcid.org for experimentation. Now, the slide that you're seeing right now is showing some links to documentation that you will want to look at if you are pursuing a custom ORCID API integration. And again, I will be sending these slides out after the session, so you will have access to these links for your reference later. When you're ready to go live with your custom integration, you would fill out ORCID's form to request production credentials, and that form is shown here on the screen. Also note, if you are working with a vendor system that already has ORCID functionality built in, which many common vendor systems do have, especially research information systems. For those, you can often just directly fill out the form requesting production credentials. You don't have to go to the sandbox first. And through that, ORCID would send you your client ID and client secret that would then be used to turn on the integration in whatever vendor system that you are using. Okay. And this slide on that note shows a handful of common vendor systems that have ORCID functionality already built in, where you can just request production credentials directly. And again, for these systems, you can skip the sandbox credentials and just get your production credentials to turn on the functionality in these vendor systems. If you're curious or unsure about the status of systems that you are using, the ORCID US Community website has a list of common systems with notes about what is needed to enable ORCID integration in each of these. And if a system that you are using is not listed on this site, or you have questions, just let me know and I can help you with your specific context. So now that you know a little bit more about the ORCID public and member APIs, we're going to turn our attention specifically to the details of the member API and address the question first of why an institution would want to integrate its systems with the ORCID member API. So there are 4 main benefits for institutions that use the ORCID member API. First, by using the API to have your researchers connect their ORCID IDs with your systems, you can gather the authenticated ORCID ID number for each person, and that helps to mitigate any confusion that would be caused by name ambiguity amongst your researchers. So for example, if you have multiple people with the same name or the same initials, or if you have researchers that have changed names over the course of their career, you can distinguish between individuals using their ORCID ID number rather than just their name. Second, by using the API to read data from your researchers' ORCID records, you can not only save time by collecting information from ORCID through the API as opposed to having your researchers fill out forms over and over again. But you can then use individual ORCID data to help with assessment of activities and things like promotion and tenure review. And you can also look at aggregate ORCID data to assess activity and impact more broadly, maybe at the departmental or institutional level. Third, by using the API to write data to your researchers' ORCID records, you can not only save time for your researchers so they don't have to enter their own data manually, but you can maintain control over how your organization's name appears on their ORCID records and make sure that the data written is accurate and trustworthy, essentially contributing to the integrity of the metadata that is then being used by other stakeholders in the ORCID ecosystem, including other units within your own institution. And finally, all of this is designed to ultimately save time and reduce administrative burden, both for your researchers and research administrators and staff. By utilizing the auto update functionality as well of the Premium Member API, you can save even more time for everyone involved because your systems can automatically get notified and updated anytime a change is made to your researchers' ORCID records. So when you look at all of the different types of information that could be read, written, and updated via ORCID, you can start to see how transferring data using the ORCID API could be useful in a variety of contexts. Depending on your existing systems, priorities, and needs, ORCID records can include information like biographical details, so what you're seeing here, a biography up at the top, and then along the side, you've got fields for other names that may have been used for publishing or other contexts, websites, keywords, other identifiers, and email contact information. We've also got past and current employment information, education and qualifications, invited positions and distinctions, memberships and service, funding award received, works and contributions, also peer review activity, and research resources that were used during the course of research. So for example, labs, facilities, equipment, collections, any kind of resource that somebody may have used during their research. So all of these different types of data can be read from or written to ORCID records using the ORCID Member API so that you can know exactly who did what, assess activities, assert activities and affiliations, and save time for everyone involved by allowing data to be transferred automatically, as opposed to, again, asking researchers to manually fill out forms or submit static CVs every time they have to report their activities. Okay, so at this point, you know that the ORCID API allows institutions to connect with researchers' authenticated ORCID IDs and read and write to any of the data that could be contained within an ORCID record. But how does all of this actually work? So, the purpose of the ORCID API is to allow various institutional systems to use ORCID IDs and data from ORCID records in an accurate and trustworthy manner. So we really want to avoid having people type in their ORCID ID or copy and paste their ORCID ID into a form or otherwise manually enter their ORCID ID into a system. So with a 16-digit number, there's room for typos and mistakes if you're typing this in manually. So even if just one number is entered incorrectly, then it's really not going to be reliable for anybody. Additionally, having the researcher type in their ORCID ID into a system does not enable the authenticated, trusted, and interoperable connection between the researcher's ORCID data and your institutional systems that the API provides. So rather than doing this, the best practice for gathering accurate, authenticated ORCID IDs and enabling interoperability is to configure your systems to use the ORCID API. So in order to do that, In order to configure your systems with the ORCID API, the process starts by getting permission from your affiliated researchers to connect with their authenticated ORCID ID number and interact with their ORCID record as a trusted party. The main thing to remember here is that in accordance with ORCID's principle that the researcher has full control over their ORCID data, in order to interact with the researcher's ORCID record as a trusted party, you will need their permission. So that permission is granted by having the user go through an authentication process that's called OAuth from within your system integration. So OAuth is basically a process by which the user can grant permission for an application to access data from a third-party system. So if you think that you're not familiar with OAuth, you probably have actually seen it in action before. So for example, what I've got here on the screen is a sign-in page for Goodreads where it's asking, I can either log in directly or I can use my Facebook or Amazon credentials to log into Goodreads. And so that is an example of OAuth. Another good example of a platform that actually offers ORCID as a way to sign into their system is Publons, and you're seeing that here. So they're offering the user the ability to log in either using Facebook, I think that's Gmail, LinkedIn, or ORCID. So that's just kind of an example of what OAuth looks like. So with ORCID specifically, the OAuth process consists of 4 steps for typical system integrations. First, the user will need to go to a web portal that you have set up at your institution where they can access the ORCID OAuth process for your integration. We typically call this the ORCID Create and Connect or the ORCID portal. Then typically the user logs in with their institutional credentials first to verify their identity and affiliation with your institution. Then the user is asked to either register for their ORCID ID if they don't already have one, or log into their ORCID record if they do already have one, and that verifies their identity on the ORCID side. And then finally, the user will be asked to authorize permission for your institution to connect with their ORCID record. So once the user has gone through this process and granted permission, then you can interact with their ORCID record as a trusted party. And I'm going to actually give us a walkthrough and demonstrate this process in just a minute. So for each integration, you can choose which permissions you want to ask your researchers for, or you can allow them to select which permissions they want to grant. But at the very basic level, you can just ask to get their ORCID ID and nothing else. However, this would not really be taking full advantage of the benefits of the ORCID Member API. It would help with the name disambiguation, but you wouldn't be able to read and write, as we saw earlier. So you can also ask to read any limited access data from their ORCID record. You can ask to write data to their ORCID record, and you can also include the option for allowing automatic updates if you're using the Premium Member API. This image shows the variety of different permissions, and with the ORCID API, these permissions are known as scopes that members can use in their integration. So the first is Authenticate, and this can be used with either the public or the member API to simply just gather the authenticated ORCID ID. This read limited scope, that is what allows for reading any limited access information on the ORCID record, so any of that data that is set to trusted parties visibility. And if you're using this read limited scope or any of the following scopes that we're going to cover, they automatically include the Authenticate scope as well. The activities update scope, this is what allows for writing affiliations and activities such as employment, education, works, funding, and the other data points that are found in the main column of the ORCID record. The person update scope is what allows for writing biographical information to the ORCID record. So things like the biography, other names used, country, websites, keywords, other identifiers, and email addresses. And if you don't want to ask for permission to read their limited access data, you can instead explicitly ask for permission to read the public data on their ORCID record. Although because the data is public, they don't necessarily have to grant explicit permission for you to read their public data, because really anybody can read their public data. But it is an option. And finally, the webhook scope. That is what will enable the auto updates between your system and the researcher's ORCID record anytime those changes occur. So each of these scopes corresponds to a specific benefit of using the ORCID member API, and it's that same quadrant that we saw earlier. So just to make it very, very clear, Authenticate will allow for gathering the authenticated ORCID ID that will help with name disambiguation. The read limited scope will help to pull data into your systems to be used for assessment purposes. The activities update and person update scopes will allow for your systems to write data to your researchers' ORCID records, and all of the scopes, as well as the webhooks, will allow for saving time and reducing administrative burden. So to demonstrate how all of this works, I'm going to walk us through a typical ORCID OAuth interaction to show both what the user will see, as well as a little peek behind the scenes as to what the code of a system will look like and how that needs to be configured. And I'm going to be using examples from Boston College. So shout out and thank you to John O'Connor at Boston College for being willing to share their example. So the first step is to provide some sort of user-facing portal that's designed to educate people about ORCID, what it is, and why they should care, and to prompt them to connect their ORCID ID with your system integration. So what you're seeing here is the Boston College LibGuide on ORCID. So notice that the How to Register section, rather than linking to the ORCID website directly, they actually provide a local Boston College link. So if we click on this link, it will take us to a page where first we need to sign in with our institutional credentials so that the institutional system knows who we are. Then once we're logged in, we're taken to a new page that again explains what ORCID is and why we are being asked to connect our ORCID ID with the institution. And you'll notice the button that's highlighted down at the bottom. It prompts the user to create or connect their ORCID ID. So behind that button is what we call an authorization URL. And this is something that you will build, you'll build this URL basically specific to your integration. So it's comprised of the client ID, which is part of your API credentials from ORCID, and you'll see that highlighted there. Also in this URL, we have the scopes that we've chosen, which are the permissions that we will be asking the researchers to authorize. And you'll also notice there's a redirect URI, and that is the web page where you want your users to be redirected once they go through that ORCID OAuth authentication process. So that's just a little peek behind the scenes as to what that create or connect button really is. So back to our workflow, once we click that authorization URL through the Create or Connect button, we're then launched into the ORCID OAuth process. So it starts by having the user either sign in to their ORCID record if they already have one, and that will verify their ORCID ID number. If the user does not already have an ORCID ID, they can register for one right then and there. So either way, the user is logged into their ORCID account, so the system can retrieve their accurate ORCID ID number without them having to type it in manually. So at this point, the ORCID authorization screen will appear. It'll look something like this. It will have the user's name, their ORCID ID, and a note that the institution is asking them for permission to connect their ORCID record in a number of ways, depending on the scopes that were used. So in this example, we are being asked to allow the institution permission to read any limited access data and also to add and update research activities. So this is where the scopes from the authorization URL come into play. So remember what we saw, the scopes that are included in the authorization URL will determine the permissions that the researchers will be asked to grant for this integration. So in this example, the scopes are read limited and activities update. So once the researcher is ready to grant this permission, they will click authorize on the authorization screen. At that point, your system will receive back a handful of data that will need to be stored in a secure database. And that handful of data includes the person's name, their ORCID ID number, the scopes or permissions that were granted for this integration, and an access token that will allow you to interact with this specific person's ORCID record using the API. So once a user goes through the OAuth process and authorizes the connection, the permissions that they granted stay in place by default for 20 years, which is helpful for keeping up with researchers even after they leave the institution. So if you have to do grant reporting several years later and those people that were involved are no longer at your institution, if you've connected with their ORCID record, unless they revoke that connection, which they have every right to do from within their ORCID ID account, that connection will stay in place for 20 years by default. So once you have collected authenticated ORCID IDs from your researchers, you can display them in any kind of relevant system, such as faculty profiles in this example from Boston College. You can also import any public data from ORCID into your system, such as a faculty profile or reporting system. I will say that if you are asking your researchers for permission to read trusted parties only data, you might not want to, pull that data in and then display it on a public website. Your researchers may have set that data to trusted parties only for a reason. So you might just want to use that information for kind of internal assessment and not have it displayed on your public-facing website. So that's something to keep in mind. If you asked for the activities update or the person update scopes, you can also write data to ORCID records. So again, this is another example from Boston College where they have written education and employment affiliations to ORCID records. And you can see that the source of that data appears as Boston College. So it is verified that yes, this person either works at this institution or went to school here and is officially affiliated with the institution. All right. And again, when it comes to reading data from ORCID, you can pull in public data into your systems and also, the limited access data into your systems in whatever way is helpful to you. ORCID is designed to be very configurable to meet a variety of different needs. The example that you're seeing here is from North Carolina State University libraries, where they have a citation index application that they have integrated with ORCID, and then they're pulling in works from people's ORCID records into their citation index application. So you can see here I've got the red box around this entry that says the source is actually from this person's ORCID record. That means they pulled that data from ORCID into the citation index using the API. And this is really just one example of how your systems can read data from ORCID using the API. And with the examples that I just showed, we're looking primarily at the user-facing end product of ORCID data in an interaction with the API, because for the purposes of explaining kind of the basics and the benefits, we don't necessarily need to look at a bunch of slides of code. But if you are interested in seeing sample code, please let me know. ORCID does have sample code available. But just a little bit more information for you on kind of the technical aspects of the API. It is a REST API, which stands for Representational State Transfer. And basically that means that it relies on HTTPS calls or basically URLs to do all of the actions. So to search or send data, request data, retrieve, update. And so for practice and testing, you can interact with the ORCID API using a range of tools that are capable of making and receiving HTTPS requests. In real-world situations, the API interactions are completed by your system using some sort of programming language like PHP or Java or Ruby on Rails. So just kind of an FYI, most desktop HTTPS tools are run in the command line, which is the image that you're seeing here. For those who prefer a graphical interface, there are some web-based tools available. And my favorite and kind of a popular one is the Google OAuth Playground, which is a free web-based tool that is developed and maintained by Google. But that is another option, and I have a link a little bit later on that will to a tutorial on how to use that. But just to give you a little bit of additional context, this is what an example API call would look like using curl in the command line to read works from ORCID. And so it would look something like this. You'd have some header information as well as the person's access token. So I've got that access token highlighted there. The access token, if you remember from a few slides back, would have been collected during the OAuth process. So you would have that in your database on the back end. The call would also include the person's ORCID ID, which you can see towards the end of that URL. And then you would append the part of the ORCID record that you want to retrieve. So in this case, you're seeing works actually there at the end. That means you want to get works from this person's ORCID record, and you're using this access token, which means that that person granted the permission for you to do that. So once this call is sent, data would be retrieved from ORCID in either XML or JSON format, and you can specify that format within your system. An example API call using curl in the command line to write data to an ORCID record, for example, and in this example, we're writing a work, would look something like this. So again, you would need to include the access token, the person's ORCID ID, and when you're writing data, you would need to include the file path to either an XML or JSON file that contains the data that you want to send from your system to that person's ORCID record. And so the little clip that you're seeing on the screen is a sample XML file for writing a work to an ORCID record. So this is just kind of covering the basics. And so when you're ready to go more in depth with all of this functionality, ORCID does have a number of tutorials for how to use API calls to read and write ORCID data. I would also recommend, if you have time, getting a feel for how the API works by using a tutorial with the Google OAuth Playground. And I've got a link to that here. ORCID provides a tutorial. You don't have to be a developer to do the tutorial. It explains basically how to configure and use the OAuth Playground with the ORCID Sandbox member API. Also, ORCID's Getting Started guide, which is also linked here down at the bottom, that's a great place to start for documentation on getting started with Sandbox credentials and getting your own integration set up. So now that you know some of the basics, and I can see we have questions coming into the chat, and I will get to those at the end. You can start thinking about planning for or taking any existing integrations further at your own institution. So I have some tips for doing that planning. When it comes to planning ORCID integrations at your institution, keep in mind that ORCID can benefit data flow in systems across your institution, not just in one specific department or unit. So with an example of an academic research institution, a university, common stakeholders that could benefit from ORCID include those examples that you're seeing on this screen: the research office, provost, libraries, central IT, the grants office, HR, and other specific academic units. So as you start to think about adopting ORCID and integrating ORCID at your institution, take inventory of the types of different systems that are in use, and think about what internal stakeholders might need to be involved in this planning. So as you're taking stock of the systems that are being used, also think about how data is or could flow between these systems. So for example, this graphic is illustrating the use of one API credential for an integration with the central identity management system, where then ORCID data collected centrally can flow into other systems. So kind of streamlining the efforts to make the system infrastructure and data flow more efficient. And this will all really vary and depend on your specific context, the systems that are being used across campus, and the stakeholders that are involved there. Once you identify what parties should be involved, work with these stakeholders to determine things like, what do you want to do with ORCID? It's very configurable. There are lots of different ways that you can use ORCID. So thinking about what your priorities are: do you want to read data? Do you want to write data, or both? And if so, what data points are you most interested in? A good kind of emerging best practice is forming a cross-campus ORCID committee or some sort of similar group that gets together to discuss strategy for how and where to use ORCID in your systems. And you'll also want to think about, project management things like rollout and timing and outreach strategy once your integration is in place. So for example, at Florida State University, some of you may be familiar with this case study. They formed an ORCID implementation committee that's comprised of stakeholders from various different units across campus to determine the most strategic approach for ORCID adoption. And this is working quite well for them. The link that you're seeing down at the bottom is, they've kindly shared this link to their ORCID committee charter document, so you can feel free to use that maybe as an example for doing something similar at your own institution. And regardless of whether you're using vendor systems or custom systems, you'll want to make sure that you have some good end user documentation available for explaining how and why users should connect their ORCID ID with your systems, as well as a plan for doing outreach to make sure your researchers know what ORCID is and why they should get their ORCID ID and connect it with your integration. So this is just an example from Virginia Tech, where they've provided a video explaining to users how and why to connect their ORCID ID with symplectic elements, for example. So as we're wrapping up, I want to finish by covering a little bit about what the ORCID US community can do to help you get the most value from ORCID by using the ORCID API. We have a planning guide that you're seeing here, and that provides a good starting point for opening conversations and considerations around ORCID adoption. So I recommend checking this out when you get a chance. And my role as the ORCID US Community Specialist is to provide dedicated support for ORCID US member institutions. And I also am happy to help prospective members too. So at any time, I'm available for consultations, and I'm here to help with all of your ORCID questions, including helping you assess your context to see where ORCID integration would make the most sense. So please do not hesitate to contact me. My email address is there on the screen. We also have the advantage of community and sharing information. So I encourage community members to share their experiences and their own case studies so we can all learn from each other. The image that you're seeing here is a screenshot of our ORCID US Community Member Discussion Forum, for example. We also have periodic webinars, blogs, and community calls for the purpose of sharing information and examples. And we also have a number of planning guides and other resources designed to help you walk through the various considerations for planning ORCID adoption initiatives. Really, the main takeaway here is that you are not alone. The institutions that are part of the ORCID US community are at all different stages of the ORCID adoption process. So no matter where you are, if you're just getting started or if you've already done quite a bit, the community welcomes your advice, your experience, and your questions. And with that, now I'm going to open it up for discussion and questions. I see that we have several questions in the chat. And people can also feel free to pipe up, and you can unmute yourself if you want to say anything. Meanwhile, I'm going to get back up here to the questions in the chat. So I'm seeing the question about how many API keys do you get with the premium membership? The answer to that is 5. Now, let's see, some of these are somewhat long. As I recall, ORCID does not include all authors of a paper. If so, doesn't this limit the usefulness of ORCID for institutions wanting to track scholarly output? They won't know if the author was the first author and if the author didn't write a paper on their own. To answer that question, there has been a little bit of confusion around works that have multiple authors. And I'm trying to get some clarity from ORCID on that. So in some cases, the contributing authors will appear, depending on what data source they were maybe imported from. So you can import works from different sources like Scopus and PubMed and Crossref and DataCite and all sorts of those. So it kind of depends on the source of the data, although I have gotten some reports about inconsistencies with that, and so that is actually something that I'm actively trying to get squared away with ORCID. So stand by for more information on that. But in general, the idea is to be as accurate as possible with all the metadata, although it does depend on what source the metadata was added to ORCID from.
Sheila, this is Jason. Can I add to that a little bit?
I would love it if you added to that. Thank you, Jason.
So I mean, often what we're doing when we're using data from a work from ORCID is using the external identifier like the DOI to find another source of data to have the data be more complete. And so we'll take the DOI and get the cross-ref data back. I think where a lot of the issues are with data that's coming in from the search and link wizards is not necessarily the fault of even the party that's pushing the data to ORCID, because we're finding that what the publishers have pushed to Crossref, for instance, can sometimes also be incomplete. So I think it's just a matter of kind of a lot of this data throughout the whole ecosystem can have issues with it. Yeah. So it's not an ORCID specific concern.
Yeah, that is so true. Thank you, Jason, for that input. But yeah, please do stand by for more updates, because I am kind of actively, trying to find avenues to make sure that everything's as reliable as possible, which extends beyond just ORCID. I also see a question about, has there been any discussion at ORCID about linking to, say, Google Scholar, so it's possible to track citations to a paper? I will have to get back on that one. I can't think off the top of my head discussions at ORCID. I'm sure this has come up. I know that if you have a Google Scholar profile and you have works in Google Scholar, those can be exported to a BibTeX file, and then you can import those through BibTeX into ORCID. But I'm not sure the progress on doing that linking for the purposes of tracking citations. Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Sheila, this is Paige Morgan. And I actually spent some time in late December testing exporting data from Google Scholar and importing it into ORCID. The challenge is that what Google Scholar will allow you to export, although the format of BibTeX is compatible with ORCID, the Google Scholar data model and the ORCID data model are in many ways mismatched, and so that's part of what makes it tricky. So stuff ends up not getting you end up having to do a lot of manual work to classify, say, data sets as data sets, and etc.
Good points. Thanks, Paige. And I think I realized what I might do is when I send out the recording and the slides to everyone, I will also include this list of the questions and hopefully more kind of thorough answers for some of them that we're having to skip over and more information. So stand by for that, everyone. I'm just kind of going down the list of questions in the chat. How do you know if an ORCID ID has been authenticated? So that is really on a kind of integration by integration basis. ORCID does have their best practices around, for example, if you're displaying ORCID IDs on a public facing website, if those ORCID IDs were collected by having the user go through that OAuth process that I showed, then you would display it with a little ID icon and then the person's ORCID number. If those ORCID IDs were collected by having the users just manually type in their ORCID number into a manual entry field, that is recommended against, but if you do have ORCID IDs that were collected in that way, it's recommended you can have the ORCID ID displayed, but then you would ideally have in parentheses after that, say, unauthenticated, or some way of indicating that those ID numbers were not collected through the API integration in the OAuth process. So that just kind of has to do with you know, how ORCID IDs were collected for a specific system. Okay, next question. I'm assuming this is referring to the lower left quadrant of the kind of benefits quadrant that I have. So can we talk more about where the data that someone using the API might assert comes from, and what sorts of processes are involved in structuring and quality checking it? I know that some of it could come from publishers, but I'm thinking about other data that institutions might want to assert. That's a great question. So when you're thinking about writing data to somebody's ORCID record, for research institutions, primarily that would be things like employment and education affiliations, but of course you might have other data that matches up with data fields in ORCID that you have on hand. So it really just depends on what data you already have about your researchers and making some institutional decisions about what data would be beneficial to write to people's ORCID records. I would say start with the education and employment affiliations so that that relationship can become very clear. And in many cases, you might have an HR system that has that data. Some institutions have like a central enterprise data warehouse or something like that, where you're already storing information about all of your researchers. And you know, I do understand that at some institutions that data that you have on hand is not always accurate. So it would just be the extent to which you and your institution would feel comfortable asserting those affiliations. I know that Boston College, for example, is just asserting kind of a top level affiliation. So they're just saying this person, you know, works at Boston College. They're not necessarily including job titles and those kinds of details for various reasons. So that will really, you know, kind of vary depending on what data you already have available on hand. Okay, I'm seeing a question. Is there a list of what can be shared? Pure is only bringing over research output publishing items. Yeah, so from one system to another, especially if you're using a vendor system, there may be limitations on the type of data from ORCID that you can have access to. And with vendor systems like Pure, really, if you want to see more functionality and have the ability to, for example, pull in more data from ORCID through that system, you really have to kind of petition the vendor to add that functionality. If you're using a custom system, it's really up to you and what will be valuable for your own purposes. Okay, so next question. Do you have, and I realize we are at the hour, so if people have to leave, just feel free to do that. You'll get the recording and all the questions and answers after. But I'm going to just keep going, so feel free to stick with me. Do you have some actual institutional use cases, anecdotes with respect to use in tenure and promotion evaluation? And for this purpose, what advantages does ORCID provide over proprietary faculty publication tracking systems? Can't a researcher just fabricate bibliographic data? Yeah, so I do have some examples of institutions kind of working towards this, working towards using ORCID as a major source for, you know, reporting and pulling data in. I'm not sure off the top of my head if I have anyone who has a fully functioning process that's solely based on ORCID. Especially with respect to tenure and promotion specifically. But that is something that several of our institutions, I think, are working towards. But of course, I think as we all know, questions around tenure and promotion practices, you know, the discussion is happening a lot, but it may be a slow move to change existing workflows for that. We do have a blog, the ORCID US Community blog is where I try to really highlight really good examples and use cases from different institutions. So I'll include some links when I send the questions and answers out after. So in terms of advantages that ORCID provides over proprietary faculty publication tracking systems, you know, just kind of off the top of my head, thinking about ORCID as the actual faculty are involved in kind of curating their ORCID record, deciding what data they want to have shared and maybe data they don't want to have shared, as opposed to proprietary systems, you know, going out and getting data on these faculty and gathering it up, and then the faculty not necessarily having a say in what is appearing there. And so that would be kind of the initial thought that comes to my mind. Also, if you're, you know, into supporting open structures, open frameworks, as opposed to proprietary, ORCID definitely ticks that box. But I would just say the ability of faculty to have more control over what's reported. And in terms of fabricating data, yeah, I mean, anyone could fabricate data, but again, that is why the assertions in ORCID really come into play. And so as the ecosystem continues to kind of be fleshed out, having publishers write works to an ORCID record, or having, you know, some sort of organization write data to an ORCID record, that's the direction we really want to go, and that is kind of the more accurate and trustworthy approach that we're wanting to take. Of course, it's fine to have individuals fill out their own data in ORCID, but ultimately the idea is to have these organizations asserting that, yes, this person wrote this, or what have you. And that's also where, you know, DOIs come into play as well. So the more we can use DOIs and have stakeholders in the research ecosystem writing data to ORCID, the more trustworthy everything will be. Does ORCID have how-to guides for setting up OAuth pages? Yes. I will include links. I think I have some links in my slides, but I'll also include links when I send out the Q&A. But yes, they definitely have how-to guides, as well as like sample text that you can use and adapt. And they do have kind of some best practices surrounding how you present those OAuth pages to your users. So I will include that information. When a person comes from an institutional portal with the API token assigned to that institution, does ORCID connect the person's new or existing ORCID record with the institution's ringgold? So that's a really good question. So the ringgold ID is an institutional identifier. There are some other identifiers out there, GRID and FUNREF, and then there's a new one called ROR, which is the Research Organization Registry, which is going to map to GRID. So when somebody connects their ORCID ID with an institution, that ringgold ID or other identifier, that is not automatically added to the person's ORCID record. That affiliation would have to be added either by the person themselves, or it would have to be asserted by the institution. And so, for example, if I was to go into my ORCID record and add employment information, if I start typing in the name of my organization, a drop-down appears, and depending on which entry I select from the drop-down, that corresponds with a different institutional identifier. So that's how that identifier gets added, unless your institution writes that information to the person's ORCID record. But no, that does not happen automatically. Okay. Can a researcher enter a citation publication incorrectly, such as the authors that like to list themselves first or as the only author? If a researcher is entering their own information, there's definitely room for error there. So it is possible to enter things incorrectly into ORCID. And again, I think that's where the organizational assertions of data to ORCID are encouraged to mitigate that. Is it possible in an integration to pull together different sources? So grab the ORCID work with DOI and then from there pull in or link to other data sources. Google Scholar has no API and so is particularly problematic for reuse. You receive an auth token back from ORCID for the user during the OAuth dance. I'm not sure if that was part of the question or just a different comment.
Yeah, sorry. As you were answering questions, I was also kind of partially answering questions.
Oh, awesome.
Sorry.
Thanks, Jason. So Jason, do you want to describe a little bit more what you mean by your question? Oh, wait, no, that's not a question, right? That's just a comment.
That was just an answer,
Sorry,
yeah.
I'm confused.
Sorry.
Okay. No worries, no worries. Okay, I think
there was a little confusion about the pure piece. So it's technically feasible for Pure or any other system to grab any of the data from ORCID. They may not do that yet, but it's technically feasible from ORCID's perspective for them to do so. And so your answer about advocating to them to add those features is good. And I just added that encouraging those vendors to also not just pull in data from ORCID, but when possible, push data to ORCID as well, because we're seeing that ORCID has a lot of reuse in other systems that aren't going to integrate with our vended systems.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's like technically there's a lot of functionality that could be provided, but when it comes to vendor systems, a lot of the vendors are not taking full advantage of all that functionality, even though it is possible. So yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, and the more functionality that all of our systems that we're using can have when it comes to ORCID, the more everyone will ultimately benefit. And so that's the direction that we're trying to move in. It looks like all of the rest of the chat things are comments as opposed to questions. If anybody is still on the call and has lingering questions, I'm going to put my email address in just to make sure everybody has that. You can send me questions afterwards, and of course you will all get an email from me with the recording, the slides, and the Q&A. So stand by for that. But thank you all so much for staying on. I know we went a little bit over, so my apologies, and I hope the technical issues weren't too horrible. But in any case, we can go ahead and conclude for the day, and I hope everybody has a great weekend. and contact me with any other questions or comments. And thanks again.